My mother-in-law handed my husband a sealed envelope at our daughter's christening and whispered, "You need to know the truth about who you married." I smiled from across the room, adjusted the lace on Ivy's baptismal gown, and reached into my clutch for the folder I had been carrying for 6 weeks. I already knew what was in her envelope. I had written most of it myself. Let me back up. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who's been part of this community. If you're new here and you've ever felt like the people closest to you were rewriting your story behind your back, this one is for you. Subscribe. It's free, and let's get into it. My husband and I met in the way a lot of people in Charleston meet, through someone else's wedding. He was the best man. I was doing the flowers. He handed me a glass of sweet tea during the reception and told me I'd arranged the peonies wrong, which was both incorrect and charming. We were married 14 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Beaufort. His mother wore black to our wedding, not mourning black. She claimed it was her signature color. I should have paid more attention to that detail. My mother-in-law is a woman who has spent her entire adult life constructing a version of events that flatters herself. Her husband, my father-in-law, was a cardiovascular surgeon who built a practice worth several $1 million before he died of a stroke 6 years ago. He left the estate largely to her with specific provisions for both sons, my husband, who is the older, and his younger brother, who I'll call what I've always called him privately, the one everyone else in the family treats like he can do no wrong. His name is Conrad. I have never liked Conrad. I want to be honest about that from the start, because I think it matters. Conrad is charming the way a timeshare salesman is charming. You walk out of the conversation feeling warm and slightly confused about what you agreed to. He works in commercial real estate in Atlanta, drives cars he probably shouldn't be able to afford, and has been engaged twice without ever actually getting married. He is 41 years old. He has never once, in the 7 years I've been in this family, asked me a single question about myself that wasn't followed immediately by a statement about himself. My husband manages the family's investment accounts, a responsibility his father gave him explicitly and in writing. He is meticulous. He is honest to the point of occasionally being socially inconvenient. He is the kind of man who returns the extra change when a cashier makes a mistake. I chose him very deliberately, and I would choose him again. Ivy was born after 2 years of trying and 1 round of IVF that left us both hollowed out in ways we're still recovering from. When I finally saw her heartbeat on that monitor, a real heartbeat, not the flutter that had disappeared at 9 weeks the year before, I cried in the parking lot of the clinic for 20 minutes while my husband held my hand and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. The christening was her day. We had planned it for 3 months. My mother had flown in from Phoenix. My best friend had driven down from Columbia. The church was the one where my husband's father was eulogized, which felt meaningful and right. Ivy wore the same gown my husband had worn at his own christening, which his mother had kept in a cedar chest for 37 years. She brought it to the church herself, which I had found touching at the time. I did not find it touching afterward. The moment came during the reception. We'd rented the private dining room at a restaurant on East Bay Street that we loved. Exposed brick and good lighting and a menu that didn't take itself too seriously. About 40 people, immediate family, close friends, our godparent couple. Ivy had finally stopped fussing and was asleep in her carrier, and I had just started to feel the particular relief of a woman who has successfully pulled off a complicated event with a 4-month-old. That's when I saw my mother-in-law cross the room toward my husband with something in her hand. I watched him take it. I watched his face go from relaxed to confused to something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. He looked up and found me immediately, the way he always does in a crowded room. And I could see him trying to understand what I was thinking. I was thinking, here we go. My sister-in-law, Conrad's older sister, who I genuinely like and who has the complicated position of loving everyone in this family while seeing them all clearly, appeared at my elbow. "What is she doing?" she said, very quietly. "Something she's been planning for a while," I said. My mother-in-law raised her voice just enough, not screaming, not a scene, technically, but loud enough that the nearest tables went quiet and the quiet spread. She said that she had something important to share, something that affected the family, something that my husband deserved to know before he continued making financial decisions on behalf of people who might not actually be his responsibility. The room held its breath. She said she had documentation proving that I had been engaged before, not just dated, but formally engaged, to a man who had a fraud conviction in Georgia, and that I had concealed this during the prenuptial process, and that she had reason to believe I had married her son with the intention of accessing the family trust under false pretenses. Silence. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. My husband said my name, just once. I smiled. I said, "She's right that I was engaged before. I've told you that." I said it to him, not to her. I kept my voice level and warm. "I've also told you that the engagement ended because he wasn't who he said he was. I'm glad it ended. What I've never been able to figure out," I said, turning to her then, "is how you got his name. Because the only person in this family I ever told was Conrad." The pause that followed was extremely informative. I opened my clutch and took out the folder. This is the part where I need to go back even further to explain how a folder ends up in a woman's clutch at her daughter's christening. It started 8 months earlier, with a phone call I wasn't supposed to receive. My husband and Conrad share a financial advisor, or they did at the time. His name is Walter. He's been working with the family since before my father-in-law died, and he is the kind of careful institutional man who usually says very little. He called my husband's cell phone one afternoon when my husband was in surgery. He's an orthopedic surgeon, I should have mentioned that, and I picked up because I recognized the number and thought it might be important. Walter apologized for bothering me. Then he said he'd been reviewing the discretionary sub-account that Conrad managed as part of his share of the estate, and he had some concerns about certain transfers he couldn't reconcile, and he wanted to make sure my husband was aware before the next quarterly review. I wrote down everything Walter said. I told him my husband would call him back. Then I sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. The transfers Walter had flagged totaled nearly $200,000 over 3 years. They moved through Conrad's account in amounts just under the reporting threshold. $9,400 here, $9,600 there, structured in a way that anyone who works in finance would recognize immediately as intentional. They went to an LLC registered in Delaware with a registered agent but no traceable principals and a business description that said consulting services. My husband confronted Conrad about it 2 weeks later. Conrad had an explanation for everything. He always does. The LLC was a real estate vehicle he'd set up for a deal that fell through, he said. The transfers were loans to himself that he intended to repay. He was apologetic, reasonable, and very convincing. My husband, who trusts people in the way that genuinely honest people sometimes do, was largely satisfied. I was not satisfied. I have a background in corporate compliance. I left it to work in floral design, which is a choice I've never regretted, but the training doesn't leave you. I know what structured transactions look like. I know what they're for. And I know that when someone describes a business arrangement and every single detail can be verified but none of them add up to anything, that's not a coincidence. I also know that when your brother-in-law has a detailed, specific conversation with your mother-in-law the week before she starts asking pointed questions about your past, questions she has never asked in 7 years of family dinners, that's not a coincidence either. I hired a forensic accountant. Her name is not important, but she is extremely good at what she does, and she charges accordingly. Over 4 months, she traced the LLC's history, located 2 other entities connected to the same registered agent, and found a paper trail that led to a private individual in Savannah who turned out to be Conrad's former business partner, a man with his own history of financial irregularities and a very interesting set of connections to several failed development deals in the Atlanta area. Conrad had been moving money out of what he and my husband shared administrative access to. Not the core estate, but the operating accounts their father had set up for family expenses and maintenance of 2 properties they still co-owned. He had been doing it slowly and carefully for years. The total, by the time the accountant was finished, was closer to $340,000. More to the point, my mother-in-law knew. There were texts, forwarded to me by my sister-in-law, who had found them on a shared family tablet and did not hesitate for a single second about what to do with them. My mother-in-law had been aware of the transfers for at least 18 months. She had not told my husband. What she had done in that same period was begin researching me, my past, my former engagement, the fraud conviction that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a man I had walked away from at 26 years old when I discovered who he actually was. She was building a case, not to protect her family, to redirect attention. The folder I brought to the christening contained the accountant's summary report, the LLC registration documents, the bank records with the structured transfers highlighted, a copy of the relevant text messages, and a one-page letter from a Georgia attorney confirming that I had cooperated voluntarily with the investigation into my former fiancé's fraud case as a witness, not a subject. I handed it to my husband. I watched him read the first page. I watched him read the second. I watched him look at his mother in a way I had never seen him look at her before. She started talking. She said the financial situation was complicated and there were things he didn't understand about the pressures Conrad had been under, the business environment, the deals that hadn't worked out, the stress he'd been carrying. She said Conrad was family and family handled things privately. She said I had no business involving outside accountants in family finances without her son's knowledge. My father-in-law's sister, who is 73 and does not waste words, said from across the table, he knew. She showed him the report last month. My mother-in-law stopped talking. I said, quietly, that I had shown my husband the preliminary findings in March, that we had decided together how to proceed, that the envelope she had brought to her daughter's christening was a distraction she had built from a history I had never hidden from my husband, and that he had known about since our second year of dating. I said that I was sorry it had come to this in this room on this day, but that if she had wanted a different conversation, she had had many opportunities to have it. The room was very quiet. Ivy slept through the whole thing. Conrad was seated at the far end of the table. He had not said a word since my mother-in-law started speaking. He looked, for the first time in my experience of him, genuinely small. My sister-in-law stood up and asked their mother very gently to step outside with her. My husband's godfather, a retired judge who had known the family for 40 years, looked at Conrad and said simply, "Son, you need a lawyer." The days that followed were not clean or simple. I want to be honest about that too. My husband spent most of the first night in his office going through financial records. He didn't sleep. I brought him coffee at 2 in the morning and sat on the couch across from him and didn't try to make it better, because some things can't be made better right away. They just have to be survived and then slowly sorted. Conrad called 3 times. My husband did not pick up. On the 4th call, he picked up, and I heard him say, very quietly, that he needed Conrad to speak directly to their attorney and not to him for the foreseeable future. Then he hung up and sat very still, and I could see the work he was doing inside himself, the work of separating what he knew his brother had done from what he still felt for him, which were 2 things that couldn't simply be reconciled. "Did you know it was going to be this much?" he asked me eventually. "Not at first," I said. "I knew something was wrong when the first number came back." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I had thought about how to answer this for months. "Because I needed to be certain," I said, "and because I knew what it would cost you. I wanted to be sure before I asked you to pay it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She built a file on you to use against you." "Yes." "Well, she knew about Conrad?" "Yes." He put his head in his hands. I sat with him and didn't say anything. There are moments that don't have language, and this was one of them. My sister-in-law came over 2 days later. She is a family therapist, genuinely, professionally, not just temperamentally, and she has spent her adult life watching her family from the particular angle that middle children with clear vision often occupy. She sat at my kitchen table and told me she had suspected Conrad for over a year. She had seen things in the account statements when their mother had asked her to help with some paperwork last spring, and she had raised it gently once and been told it was under control and that she was misreading it. "She chose him," she said, "not with anger exactly, with the particular grief of a person who has already processed the first several stages. She has always chosen him. Even when he was 15 and lying to Dad's face about where the money from the yard sale went, she found a way to explain it. I don't know if she can stop. I don't think she wanted to stop, I said. I think she wanted it buried. We sat with that for a while. The legal process that followed was long and not the subject of this story. What I will say is that the estate attorney filed a civil claim against Conrad, that the structured transactions were flagged to federal regulators by our financial advisor, which Walter had been waiting to do pending my husband's decision, and that Conrad's real estate practice did not survive the attention that followed. Two of his largest clients were institutional investors who did not continue the relationship once the documentation became part of the public record. My mother-in-law hired her own attorney. She and my husband did not speak directly for 4 months. Ivy learned to sit up on her own during those 4 months. She learned to grab things and laugh at the dog and put absolutely everything in her mouth with complete confidence. She was gloriously unaware of all of it. Watching her was the thing that kept the weight from becoming unmanageable. What I did not expect was the conversation that happened at month 3, when my mother-in-law called and asked if she could come over. Not to my husband, to me. Directly to me. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while my husband was at the hospital. I made coffee. I did not try to make her comfortable beyond that. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked, for the first time since I'd known her, like a woman her actual age. She said she had not understood when she raised her sons that protecting someone from consequences was a different thing than loving them. She said she had told herself for years that she was holding the family together, keeping things smooth, preventing damage. She said she had genuinely believed that I was a threat, not from anything I'd done, but because my husband listened to me, because I noticed things, because I was not easy to manage. I wanted you to be the problem, she said. It was easier. I didn't say that I knew. I didn't say I understood. I said, he's your son, and I'm not asking you to stop loving him. But he took money from your other son. He took it deliberately for years, and you helped him hide it. That's what we have to work with now. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, I know. We didn't hug. We didn't have a moment. Real life doesn't usually work that way, and I have never been interested in performances of reconciliation. But she asked, before she left, if she could bring a gift for Ivy. I said she could. She came back the following week with a hand-stitched quilt she had made herself, and I could see from the stitching that she had started it before the christening. Maybe before any of this had broken open, and I didn't say anything about that either. I just thanked her. My husband took 6 months to find a way back to something like equilibrium. It wasn't a straight line. There were dinners where he was quiet in ways I couldn't reach. There were nights when I'd hear him moving around in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and I'd come downstairs and we'd just sit together. We had started couples therapy a month after the christening. Not because anything was wrong between us, but because we both understood that what had happened was the kind of thing that could quietly hollow out a marriage if you weren't paying attention. The therapist asked me in one of the individual sessions whether I felt vindicated. I thought about the word for a while. Not exactly, I said. I felt afraid for a long time, and then I felt determined. Vindicated implies there was a moment when it felt good, and I don't think that's quite right. What did it feel like? Necessary, I said. Like closing a window before the rain came in. You're not glad it was raining. You're just glad you noticed in time. Conrad reached out to my husband through their sister 8 months after the christening. Not to dispute anything. Not to explain. Just to say he was sorry, in the thin and insufficient way that people who have caused a great deal of harm sometimes apologize when the harm is already calcified into record. My husband read the message for a long time and then set his phone down and said he wasn't ready. I didn't push him either way. That part was his to carry. What I can tell you is that Ivy is now 11 months old and has strong opinions about avocado and the specific stuffed rabbit she has named, as best we can tell, by pointing at it and shrieking with recognition every time she sees it. She has her father's eyes and my mother's stubbornness and absolutely no knowledge that the world is anything other than large and full of things to grab. There is an inheritance that is being restructured, slowly and carefully, by attorneys who are paid to understand things I am not required to understand. There is a family that looks different than it did a year ago. There is a woman who showed up at a christening with an envelope full of misdirection and who is learning at 70 years old what it means to finally be accountable. There is my husband, who told me last week that he was glad I'd been meticulous, that he wished it hadn't been necessary, but that he was glad. I told him, so am I. My mother-in-law came to Ivy's first birthday party. She sat in the corner of our backyard and watched my husband push Ivy in the little swing we'd hung from the oak tree. And at one point, I looked over and she was crying quietly in the way older women sometimes cry at things that are happening too fast. I brought her a slice of cake. She took it. She said she looks like him when he was small. I said she did. We stood together for a moment watching them. Two women who had been in opposition for a year, standing in a backyard in the afternoon light, watching the same child swing. The war, such as it was, had ended not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small truths that couldn't be taken back. And what remained? The marriage, the house, the little girl laughing in the oak tree's shadow was built on ground that had finally been cleared. That's the only kind of foundation worth building on. I keep coming back to the moment my mother-in-law sat across from me at that kitchen table and said, "I wanted you to be the problem." Not because it was the most painful thing she'd ever done to me. It wasn't. But because it was the most honest. And honesty, even when it arrives years too late, has a way of changing the shape of everything that came before it. What happened in my family wasn't unusual in the way people sometimes think betrayal is unusual. It was ordinary. A mother loved one son more carefully than the other and called it protection. A brother took what wasn't his and called it borrowing. A woman built a file full of misdirection and called it looking out for her family. None of them woke up deciding to be villains. They just kept making the easier choice over and over until the easier choices had stacked up into something that couldn't hold its own weight anymore. I think about what it actually took to get to the other side of it, not the confrontation at the christening. That part lasted maybe 4 minutes. I mean the 8 months before it. The forensic accountant's invoices I paid out of my own account without telling anyone. The legal pad I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk where I wrote down every number that didn't add up. The nights I lay next to my husband while he slept and ran through the timeline in my head, making sure I hadn't made a mistake. Making sure I was certain before I asked him to pay the price of knowing. That's the part nobody sees. Doing the right thing quietly for a long time without any guarantee it will matter. I've thought a lot about what I want Ivy to understand about this when she's old enough. Not the drama of it. She'll hear some version eventually, families talk, but the underneath of it. The part that was actually hard, because I think we do young people a disservice when we only tell them that integrity matters. Of course it matters. But we don't always tell them that integrity is exhausting and slow, and sometimes you have to carry it alone for months before it counts for anything. What I wanted, what I chose, was to be someone my daughter could look at clearly someday and not find a gap between who I said I was and what I actually did. That's a different kind of motivation than revenge, and it held up better over 8 months than anger would have. My husband is a careful, honest man who trusted the people he was supposed to be able to trust. He got deceived anyway. That's not a failure of his character. It's a consequence of other people's choices. But what I learned watching him process it is that the people who have actually done the slow internal work don't collapse when the ground shifts. They grieve, they adjust, they rebuild. He did all three. I was proud of him in a way I didn't quite have words for. Conrad, as far as I know, is still in Atlanta. Whether he's rebuilt something of his own or just moved on to the next version of the same patterns, I genuinely don't know. I hope for his sake it's the former, not for my sake, just because I've seen what the other road looks like and it ends the same way every time, alone in a room with the evidence of what you chose. Ivy turned 1. She doesn't know any of this yet. She just knows the yard and the dog and the oak tree and the rabbit. She screams out with joy every morning. That's enough for now. The ground we cleared is hers to build on,